Hello, and welcome to Masterclass Leading Yourself. I'm going to be your instructor. I'm Amer Kaissi, and I live here in San Antonio in Texas. And I want to thank you for joining me for this great course. I hope that you will enjoy it. I plan to make it worth your time and worth your money. So let me start with our first session, which is we're going to start talking about self-awareness. And obviously, self-awareness is a very important topic for leading yourself. But before we dive deep into it, I want to clarify some expectations. I'm sure you have some questions about how this course is going to go. So let me tell you a little bit about how we're going to do things with this course. In terms of expectations, many of the topics that I'm going to cover in the course are probably old topics or familiar topics that you've been exposed to in the past. However, what I plan to do is to bring a fresh perspective on these topics, a different way of thinking about them. And that different way of thinking about them is going to be mostly inspired and supported by the research and the evidence. So there are a lot of opinions about leadership out there. There's a lot of books and articles being written on leadership based on people's opinions, and that's important. But what I plan to do in this course is a little bit different in that I don't want to just tell you opinions, but what I want to tell you mostly is what does the research say? What does the science and the evidence say, right? W. Edward Deming said once, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And I'm sure that you're not taking this course just to hear another person's opinion, but you want to see what the research is. In addition to that, we're going to try to balance things out. And in addition to the research, we'll share some organizational case studies as well as some stories from my experience. And in this way, we will be balancing the right brain and the left brain. Different people learn different ways. Some people prefer the data and the evidence, and others prefer the stories and the case studies. So hopefully, by balancing those two approaches, we'll be able to meet your educational needs. I'm a huge sports fan. I like soccer. I also like the Spurs. Obviously, I live in San Antonio, so I'm going to be sharing a lot of sports examples that will help us clarify some topics. So hope that you will enjoy that. Also, what you will notice is a common theme in the sessions is I'll have a lot of book recommendations. In every session, there will be a number of books that I talk about during these videos. And in the session itself, you will see a document that says readings. And in the readings, I will include all of the books that I've talked about, and there will be a link to their site. So if you feel that a book will be helpful for you, you can jump in and get that book and start reading it. Most importantly, though, more important than the research and the case studies and the examples and the books, what I hope is that you will leave this course with practical take-home behaviors that will help you start making changes in your own leadership style as soon as possible. So the last session is all take-home behaviors. And I hope that you will take these with you and start implementing them as soon as possible in your own leadership, but also start teaching them to your team and to people in your department, as well as spreading them throughout your organization. So now that we've clarified the expectations, let's jump right into this topic of leading the self. So this course is called Leading the Self. I'm a strong believer that you can't lead other people unless you know how to lead yourself. So the first circle in leadership is leading the self. And once you master that, you can move on to leading the team, which is another course that I offer. And then leading the organization, obviously, in order to reach high performance. So this is the framework that will guide our thinking throughout this course, is that first you have to understand how you lead yourself before you can lead others and before you lead organizations. All right, here's an outline of what we plan to talk about today. First, I want to talk about what is this concept of self-awareness. I want to share with you some tactics for improving your own self-awareness, but I also want to address the important topic is, how to deal with other people who may have low self-awareness. How do we how do we deal with these situations that many of us encounter at work? You will notice that I'll do a lot of these short reflections throughout the course. I'm a strong believer in short reflections. So what I would like you to do now is to pause the video and write down a few notes on a piece of paper for yourself about what you think self-awareness is. And what is this concept of self-awareness and what does it mean to you? I find that when you think about something on your own first, and then you receive the material on it, the chances of you retaining the material is much higher. All right, so you're gonna pause the video now, and then we'll get back together. All right, welcome back. So I'm sure you've had your own ideas about self-awareness. Let me talk to you first about the importance of self-awareness in leadership. Bill George is a Harvard Business School professor. A few years ago, he wrote a book called Discover Your True North. And in the book, he made a very strong claim that self-awareness is the starting point of leadership, that there's nothing more important in leadership for a leader than self-awareness. And without self-awareness, a leader cannot achieve anything in terms of performing well for himself or herself, for the team, as well as for the organization. Now, there's all kind of research that shows that at a certain critical threshold of self-awareness, performance for employees as well as for leaders really takes off and really it starts increasing at a very high rate. So we know how important self-awareness is. In 2018, Harvard Business Review published an article by a controversial title that says self-awareness can help leaders more than an MBA can. Now, obviously, I'm an educator. I teach in a master's program, so I did not like the title that much, but they did make some good points. So this was based on a study of 1,000 leaders in all kinds of international companies in different industries. And the outcomes of the research, or the conclusion from the research, was that when they compared leaders at higher levels in the organizations with those at lower levels in the organizations, what they found was that those leaders demonstrated stronger self-awareness. They knew themselves well and they knew their impact on others better than the leaders at lower levels in the organization. So what does that mean? That means these findings can be interpreted in two different ways. The first way is that stronger self-awareness accelerates the promotion process. So it's people who have more self-awareness that are going to be chosen more to be promoted and to be given more responsibilities. The other interpretation is that it's probably when leaders were given new responsibilities and were, promoted into higher levels of executive positions, that's when they realized that they had to increase their self-awareness, and they went about it by working with executive coaches, for example. So the conclusion from the article is not that a master's degree is not important. Obviously, it's important, but rather that it's necessary but not sufficient. That to really advance in organizations, leaders need to develop their self-awareness. Now, if you're going to read only one book and only one book on self-awareness, my recommendation would be a book called Insight by organizational psychologist and researcher Tasha Eurich. So what Dr. Eurich did is that she studied a large number of people and assessed their self-awareness and asked them about their self-awareness. One of the interesting findings from the research is that 95% of people think that they are self-aware, but the real number is actually closer to 10 to 15%. What this means is that on any given day, most of us are lying to ourselves about lying to ourselves. Very interesting, right? It's actually very similar to when you ask people about their driving skills. The majority of people think that they are excellent drivers, and obviously that is not possible. So in the research, they followed thousands of people over time, and they tried to identify the people who were able to increase their self-awareness over time. These were a small number of people. They called them actually in the research the unicorns because they were so rare. So what did those people who increased their self-awareness over time do differently from other people? What were the pillars of self-awareness? These people were different from other people in that they really understood their own values. They also understood their own patterns of behavior. And very importantly, they understood their impact on others. So let's talk about each one of these pillars. First, the values. We all know that values are those principles that guide how we live our personal and our professional lives. Values are what we call our non-negotiables, right? So these are the things that we try to live our lives by. Now, very important for people with self-awareness is that they don't just declare their values to others, but they live their values on everyday basis. Another very important aspect of that is to look for historical evidence, right? So Ben Franklin was a great leader that really focused on living his own values. So he identified for himself what he called 12 virtues, and he held himself accountable for living according to these virtues on a daily basis. I mean, the amount of self-discipline that he had is amazing. For example, what he would do is he will have a weekly checklist and he will have those 12 values, and then he will give himself a bad mark on the day when he felt that he didn't live his value or his virtue to the point that he expected himself to do. Another aspect of high self-awareness is understanding our own patterns of behavior, understanding how we think, how we feel, and how we behave in certain situations. Now, obviously, these days, there are hundreds of assessments and tests that allow us to understand better our personalities, right? Our patterns of behavior. For example, you have the very well-known Myers-Briggs, the MBTI, right? And everyone knows their 4 letters, INISFJ. And you ask anyone, they know their 4 letters. Organizations are also using something called the DISC, right? The 4 different types, the D, the I, the S, and the C. In my own executive coaching, I use a different assessment called the Berkman assessment. And if you've signed up for this course and you want to take the Berkman assessment, that will be available. And I'll sit down with you by phone and we'll go over your Berkman. What I like about the Berkman assessment is that it doesn't just tell us what our usual behavior is, but it also tells us what our needs are, how we expect others to treat us, and when others don't treat us the way that we want them to treat us. It tells us about our stress behavior, our most dysfunctional behavior. So I really like that. By the way, there's been a lot of question marks about the validity and the reliability of the Myers-Briggs test. And a lot of people are saying that it's not based on any science, despite the fact that it's very popular. Many experts are questioning its validity and reliability, and even going as far as saying that, you might as well use the Harry Potter sorting hat and you'll get similar accuracy as the Myers-Briggs. Nonetheless, another aspect, a very important aspect of self-awareness is understanding our own personality. The last part, which I really want to focus on, is that self-awareness is not just about sitting in a room and understanding our own strengths and weaknesses, but it's also about understanding our impact on others. So how our behavior affects others is also very important. And the only way we can understand that, or the only way we can get knowledge about that, is to ask others. So we're starting to see how this concept of self-awareness has some internal aspects to it as well as some external aspects to it. So let's go back to Ben Franklin, right? We said he had those 12 virtues that he was working on and that he identified as very important for him. One day he actually went to talk to one of his friends and he said, I'm working on these 12 virtues. Do you have any suggestions for me? And his friend said, you know what? I think you should add a 13th one. And he said, that 13th one is humility. So Ben Franklin said, why humility? And he said, because you come across as overbearing, because you don't listen, because you always want to win arguments. So this is an example how when you think about yourself on your own, you do come up with some good things, but sometimes you miss a lot of stuff. For example, humility was a blind spot for Ben Franklin. He wouldn't have been able to realize that this is an area that he needs to work on if it wasn't for his friend, for an external person to tell him about that. So when we really think about those pillars of self-awareness, we said values, patterns of behavior or personality, as well as impact on others. The first 2 are internal. The first 2 are things that we can think about on our own. But the impact on others, that we can only identify by asking others. Here again, I would like you to take another short reflection, and I would like you to think, based on how we define self-awareness so far, what do you think are some ways that you can go about to improve your own self-awareness? Again, pause the video, write down a few notes, and then come back to join us. So what are some tactics? I'd like to share with you some tactics that are based on research and that are proven to improve self-awareness. First, as we said, there is an internal process. which is to think and reflect on your own about your own strengths and about your weaknesses or areas for improvement. But as importantly, there is an external process in which we go out there and ask for feedback, but also for something called feed-forward, which I will explain in a minute. So the internal process starts with thinking and reflection. Right off the bat here, I want to clarify that we're talking about reflecting rather than ruminating, right? We want to think about things, but we don't want to overthink things. We want to think and then to pivot and act rather than think and think and think and then be affected by what people call paralysis by analysis. In order to seek that, we need to look for this trait or this quality called stillness. Here I have another great book recommendation by author Ryan Holiday. By the way, if you haven't read Ryan Holiday's work, you have to. He has two amazing books, among others. One is called The Obstacle is the Way, and my favorite is called Ego is the Enemy. But the one that I'm talking about here that is relevant to self-awareness is called Stillness is the Key. And Holiday makes a case that there is way too much information today. And then in order to think clearly, we need to filter out the inconsequential from the essential. It's not enough to say I'm inclined to thinking a lot. We need to create time and space for it as leaders. Unless you create that time and the space for it, you're not going to be able to achieve that deep thinking and that reflection. So how do we go about that? You know what? The suggestions here are deceptively simple. Really, this is not rocket science. Take a walk on a busy day when you're going from meeting to meeting to meeting and everyone wants to talk to you and there's a lot of time pressure. Do something counterintuitive and go out for a walk. We're not talking about, a 5-mile walk. We're talking about a 10-minute, 15-minute walk and come back and you'll see the impact of that on your thinking reflection. Meditate. That's another one. A lot of people believe in the value of meditation and very importantly, journal. Let's talk about each one of these. Taking a walk allows us to get that white space in which we will have new ideas, in which we can reflect, in which we can think about ourselves as well as about others. Nietzsche said it's only ideas gained from walking that have any worth. So he was a huge believer in walking and the value, because when you go on a walk, you don't really have an agenda. You just let yourself go and then ideas start coming to you. Meditation is obviously a very important one. A lot of people swear by meditation. My recommendation here, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, if you're in a beginner to meditation or you're a novice, you've never even heard about it or never really considered it seriously, I'm sure you've heard about it, I would suggest a book called Wherever You Go, There You Are. This is a book that I have with me in my car all the time. Every time, wherever I am, at the doctor's office, at my son's soccer practice, I just pick it up and start reading. You can read it from anywhere. It's not like you have to read it in order, but the lessons are very deep. And my main take home is that meditation allows us to separate ourselves from our own thoughts. It's almost, the analogy that I give here is that it's the difference between being in a fast-paced action movie and watching a fast-paced action movie. And we will talk about meditation some more, but here I just want to show you a little bit of the evidence about the importance of meditation. There are hundreds of studies that have been done on meditation. Obviously, we don't have the time in this course to go over them, but here's a very quick high-level summary. The evidence shows that meditation improves not only our physical health, but our concentration, creativity, improves the relationships that we have at work, and even reduces the number of days that we miss at work. So definitely worth looking at the evidence, if nothing else, and maybe reading an article or two, or maybe considering that book that I just suggested. Journaling is definitely something that I highly suggest. I was in a meeting with a vice president not so long ago, and I was sitting in her office, and she had a lot of books on the shelves of her office. And then I noticed that there is an area in her office that was all notebooks, like notebook after notebook after notebook. And I asked her, and I said, what are these? She said, these are my leadership journals. She said that she has been writing and journaling about her leadership experience ever since she became a leader 30 years ago. And she's kept each one of those notebooks for herself. And then I asked her, I said, do you ever look at these? She said, of course, all the time. These are a gold mine for her because every now and then she picks something out And she starts thinking about, how did I used to approach situations, 15 years ago and 10 years ago and 5 years ago, and how do I approach them now? There's a lot of learning that can happen from journaling. Now, by journaling, again, we don't mean ruminating. We don't mean overthinking why I acted that way and why the other person acted that way. But rather, if you really want to get the benefit of journaling, then ask yourself the tough questions, things such as, where am I standing in my own way? What's the smallest step I can take toward the big thing today? Why am I so worked up about this situation? What blessings can I count on now, right? A lot of people have a blessing journal or a gratitude journal, or include that into their regular journaling. And finally, why do I care so much about impressing other people? A lot of self-awareness can come from answering these questions. I really like this quote from Julia Cameron, who used the analogy of the windshield wipers for journaling. Said, I like to think of journaling as windshield wipers, swiping away anything that stands between you and a clear view of your day. So journaling allows you to get a clear view of your day, whether you do it in the morning or in the evening or any time that works for you. It really allows you to get that clarity about yourself as well as about your impact on others. We talked about the internal process of self-awareness, which includes thinking and reflection. Now we're going to talk about the external process, which is you ask for feedback, but also you ask for feed-forward. So let us start with this process of feedback. Most people are familiar with the process of feedback, where you ask others for focused feedback on your best and worst behaviors. Here's what I suggest here. Pick 10 to 15 people that you know well and that know you well. Most importantly, people that you trust and people that have your best interest at heart. They could be colleagues, previous colleagues, bosses, previous bosses, friends, family members. Make sure it's a good combination, a diverse group of people, and ask them, when I show up at my best, how do I show up? And when I show up at my worst, how do I show up? Collect all of that information and look for themes, right? That's what we refer to as feedback. Now, why is this so important? Why can't we figure things out on our own? The research is very clear that others sometimes know us better than we know ourselves. Let me share with you this study. So they did this study where they brought subjects and they made them take a validated psychological survey to evaluate their personality traits, all right? So they took a test and then they had them do a self-assessment. They had their friends do a self-assessment, and then they had strangers who met them only for a few minutes also evaluate them on the same trait. And here's what they found. What they found is that for some traits, self-evaluation was more accurate, but for most traits, the way friends evaluated them was more accurate. So when compared to the validated survey, the friends' ratings were far more accurate than the participants' assessments of themselves on most of these traits, right? Very interesting. For example, on a trait like hubris, right, arrogance, or the opposite of humility, even strangers who had observed the participants for a few minutes were more accurate than the subject's rating of themselves. So their ratings were closer to the valid psychological assessment than the self-assessment done by the participants themselves. So it's very important to ask others. When we ask others, they help us identify what we call blind spots. Blind spots are these negative traits and behaviors that we are not aware of. It's almost like these things that are at the back of our head, and whenever we're interacting with people, everyone else can see them except ourselves, right? We can't see them, but everyone else can see them. For example, back to Ben Franklin, he identified a lot of different things he wanted to work on, but humility was not one thing. Humility was a blind spot for him, or lack of humility and arrogance or hubris was a blind spot for him. And it was only when his friend told him about it that he started thinking about that blind spot. By the same token, there are not just blind spots, but sometimes there are bright spots. Sometimes there are some positive traits and behaviors that we were not aware of, but our friends are aware of. And that's a great gift that they can give us, is they tell us, you have a great gift of listening, and we didn't realize that ourselves. Or they tell us, you have a very good ability or an excellent ability of leading meetings in an efficient and effective way. So that also is very good. We're not just focusing on the negative. We also want to look for the positive. So what we've talked about so far is feedback, which relates to the past. Now let's talk about a process called feed forward. So this may be a new terminology, a new term that you may not have heard about in the past. What is feed forward? Feed forward comes to us from Marshall Goldsmith, which everyone agrees is the #1 coach in the world. And Marshall wrote an amazing book. I highly recommend this book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. In the book, he describes this process of feed forward. He said, first describe your goal. What do you want to improve on, right? Based on the feedback that you've gotten from your friends and your colleagues and your supervisors and your subordinates, describe a goal. Identify the goal. For example, I want to improve my listening skills. And then go and identify a few people, again, that you trust, that have your best interests at heart, and tell them, I'm working on my listening. What would you suggest that I improve? What would you suggest that I do? And very importantly, listen carefully to when they tell you suggestions. This is a very important step, to listen and to think, and don't make excuses or get defensive. Most of us, when we go and ask for that feedback, we're very ready to start becoming defensive. When someone starts giving you a suggestion, you start saying, no, you don't understand. The reason I did this is because of this and that. That is not the right time or the right place to do that. When you're asking for suggestions, you listen carefully, you say, thank you. You've given me something to think about, and then you move on and you repeat the process with others. Here again, you're not just looking for individual comments, but you're looking for themes. So you bring in all of the feedback that you got, and then you look for themes. And based on those themes, you start changing your behavior. Very important. We need to ask other people. Don't accept your dog's admiration as conclusive evidence. They are wonderful. I'm sure you are wonderful, but also need to ask others about your impact on them. All right, we've talked so far about this concept of self-awareness, the tactics for improving self-awareness. Now we get to how to deal with people who have low self-awareness. So let's say we've worked on ourselves, we've improved ourselves. What about those others? Let's say you have a colleague or a subordinate, or in a very tough situation, a boss that lacks self-awareness. How do we go about working on them? Here again, I'd like you to take some time, maybe a minute or two, pause the video and think about it. How have you done it in the past? And based on some of the things that we talked about today, what are some of the things that you can do? All right, welcome back. What does the research tell us? So Tasha Eurich, Dr. Eurich, who I talked about earlier, who wrote the book Insight, published an article in Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago that tackled that topic very specifically. So here are some of the suggestions that she came up with based on the evidence and based on the research. The best practices is first and foremost, talk in person and not by email. I mean, that's an obvious one with everyone, not just with people who lack self-awareness, but especially for people who have lack self-awareness. You want to talk to them in person. The other suggestion is, rather than start the conversation with, can I give you some feedback? Start with, can I make an observation? So often when we start the conversation with, can I give you feedback? It makes the other person automatically defensive because they're expecting the worst. A much better way is to frame it as, can I make an observation? And finally, the most important best practice, in my opinion, that comes from that research is to focus on how the behavior limits their success and not how it affects you personally, right? Let's say that someone who lacks self-awareness is behaving in a certain way in meetings, right? Let's say that they talk a lot in meetings and they don't listen to others. Rather than going to talk to them and tell them, you know, when you engage in that behavior in meetings, it affects all of us negatively because we can't voice our opinion. A person who has low self-awareness is not likely to listen to that kind of feedback, but rather frame it in terms of how their behavior limits their own success. So rather than telling them how it influences others, start by saying, you know, when you don't listen in the meeting, or when you don't give others the chance to talk, that really limits your effectiveness as a leader. That limits your potential as a leader. That makes you look less like a leader that is able to collaborate. So frame it in terms of how it affects them rather than how it affects you or how it affects others. These best practices, chances are will help you get through to someone that has low self-awareness. And remember, you can't control their self-awareness. You can only control your own self-awareness. The only person that you can change is the person in the mirror. All right. Here, I'd like to point your attention to the assignments and the assignment and the readings. So I'm going to switch from this document, and I'm going to show you first the assignment. So this is the assignment, all right? And we also have the readings, okay? So we have assignments as well as we have readings. Let me go to the assignments, please. All right. I'm going to do a new share, and we'll do, all right, that's what I want. First, the readings, okay? So as I said, for every one of these sessions, each one of these sessions, we have the book recommendations. All of the books that I have talked about are here, as well as the majority of the articles that I talked about. Now, here's a point here. The articles are Harvard Business Review articles. This is the link to them. However, if you don't have a subscription to them, you're not going to get access to all of them. So one recommendation that I strongly have is invest in a subscription for Harvard Business Review. If you really care about your professional development, and please understand, I have no financial incentive in doing that. I just really believe that they put out really good articles based on research. Same with the books. I don't get any royalties from asking you to buy any of these books. I just really think that they are good books. All right, so that's the readings. Now let me share with you the assignments. And here we are. So the assignments are also, here we are. Here's the assignment. This assignment is what we call the reflected best self assignment. What I would like you to do here is to identify respondents and ask for feedback, but I would like you to ask them about when you are at your best, all right? Collect feedback from other people to ask them, how were you at your best? Recognize the patterns, and then compose your self-portrait. So all of the details are there in the assignment in the document, which you can find under your page. I hope that you have enjoyed this first session on self-awareness, and I will see you again in the next session. Thank you.